Okay, so before we get started today, I want to remind everybody, annotated bibliography is due tomorrow, right? And then when we come back, the proposal is going to be due. We're going to have our last presentation and our last class meeting with new material. And then on that Thursday, we're going to do a review session for the final exam, right? So a week from Thanksgiving, we're going to be doing a review session here in class. So bring questions that you have about the course material to help you study for the final. This is the stuff I want you reading over the break. It's all poetry. So today we're going to be talking primarily about colonial and immigrant communities and language. And then next time we're going to be putting that into practice, right? Or seeing how that works out in practice in literature, okay? So does anybody have any questions about anything at all that is coming due? Yes, once you.
The annotated, the stories. It said in the little paper, so we can't pick a story that we already wrote on.
You can't use a text that you wrote paper 1 on, and you can't use a text that you did your presentation on. You can take a response paper that you've written and expand that into a full-length, or take two response papers and try to expand those into a full-length argument, right? So if you've got, if you've written 2 response papers that are talking about more or less the same thing, then you can try to expand that into a bigger argument. So don't worry. Yeah, smaller assignments, yes, that's what. But yeah, you can't use anything you've already done one of the big assignments on. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so I want to talk actually a little bit about music before we get started with the class material today, in part because I think it is kind of important to understanding where immigrants fit in, where former colonials fit in to the British experience in the late 20th century, right? So after the Second World War, the British Empire starts breaking up. We'll get into more of this. When we come back from break. But by 1947, for example, right, British India is broken up into 2 independent countries, predominantly Hindu India and predominantly Muslim Pakistan, right? In the 1960s, various British possessions in Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, for example, become independent nations. And then throughout the 1970s, various smaller political entities in the Caribbean are breaking away. To the point that by the early 1980s, just about all that's left of the just about all that's left of the old British Empire are Canada, which doesn't technically declare independence until the early 1980s, but has been functioning as an independent country since the late 19th century, and a few small Northern Ireland, and a few small chunks of rock in the South Atlantic that Margaret Thatcher starts a war with Argentina over. So, as this is happening, most of these new nations have been shaped by British political and cultural institutions, as well as by their relationship to the English language. And what we see in a lot of these countries, these new countries, and a lot of the culture that's produced by people moving from these countries to Britain is often a kind of, essentially they adopt 2 strategies, right? The first we're going to call assimilation. Does anybody know what assimilation means? What it means to assimilate? Yeah, assimilation is essentially blending in, right? So a writer or artist or a person, any person, who is adopting an assimilationist position is going to make use of and participate in elements of the dominant culture and language, usually without directly trying to subvert them in any way, right? So this is one of the reasons I was playing Bohemian Rhapsody when the first couple of you entered the classroom. Does anybody know why the band Queen is at all relevant to discussions of colonialism? Does anybody have any idea why? Because yeah, this would seem like a weird choice, right? Well, the band's lead singer, Freddie Mercury, was Indian. His birth name was Farooq Balsari. Right, Freddie Mercury was a stage name. Of course, that can't possibly be somebody's real name, right? Now, he tended to downplay his Indian identity. And Queen cultivated a kind of consciously British image and played a particularly like British brand of loud glam rock. But even buried in a song like Bohemian Rhapsody that sounds like a kind of fairly typical 70s hard rock mini opera, buried within that is a reference to Freddie's Indian heritage, right? The word Bismillah, which I think means something like "be it the will of Allah" or something like that. I forget exactly what it translates to, but it's a word that he remembered from his childhood that he translated into the song, right? So that's an example of an assimilation strategy, right? Right? If nobody told you Freddie Mercury was Indian, you probably wouldn't know, right? Now, the other two songs that I played are adopting a different strategy and a different attitude towards language. Which we refer to as abrogation. The corner shop song in particular. So an abrogationist, writer or artist, rejects the dominant culture to some extent. So for example, that corner shop song, it's sung in English and it's played on Western instruments, right? It's just guitar, bass, drums. But the lyrics reference things that are specific to South Asian culture, Bollywood movies mostly. There are a lot of untranslated Hindi and Urdu words in the lyrics. And there aren't really all that many, apart from the basic pop structure of the song, there aren't a lot of gestures made to help a Western audience understand it or understand what's going on in the song. So that would be one example of how abrogation works, right? So an abrogationist writer might choose to write in either his or her native language rather than in a colonial language like English or French. Or in a localized dialect of English or French. So, for example, what we see in the Louise Bennett piece, Jamaica Language, right? She is writing in Jamaican English to try to prove a point about language. Now, one thing to note about both of these strategies is that both often involve a good deal of what the communication theorist Stuart Hall called code switching. Does anybody know what code switching is? Okay, Alex, you're nodding. What is code switching?
It's like when you talk a certain way to some people and then switch it up when you're talking to another group of people or something.
Yeah, exactly, right? You switch up the language that you're speaking depending on the community you're speaking to, right? Or the audience you're speaking to, right? So you may, like everybody does this to some extent, right? Everybody does this to some extent. Like, we don't speak the same way with our friends that we do with our teachers or with our parents or grandparents or whatever, right? But code switching kind of takes on an added dimension for minority cultures because not only are people typically code switching between different groups that they're members of, right? But they are also often expected to speak and behave a different way when dealing with the majority culture. So code switching also often kind of involves certain strategies of ethnic or racial survival, right? Within a sometimes hostile majority culture, right? So when you are someone who is always regarded within a culture as other, this takes on added dimensions. And I'm going to throw another word at you here that's going to be important to understanding all this. There's a philosophical concept called alterity. And alterity is the position of always being the other in a pair. And to give, this sounds a little confusing, right? But to give you an example of how this works, right? Imagine, you are, say, a South Asian person living somewhere in England, say Birmingham. The majority of the population around you is white British, right? Non-white people make up only about 12% of the population of the United Kingdom. So in most of your dealings with your neighbors, even if they're friendly dealings or cordial dealings, you will always be perceived as not like them. And you will internalize that perception, right? And you will always be the other because there are fewer of you. Does this make sense? Okay. And I think this is one of the concepts, the MAA song that I was playing, for you. These are some of the ideas that she is playing with. She's born in Britain, but her family is from Sri Lanka. And what she's doing, that particular song, Paper Planes, is about the irrational fears that people have about immigrants and immigrant violence and immigrant criminality. And what she's doing is taking a sample from a song by the British punk band The Clash that itself adapts a South Asian melody. And she is reclaiming that sample to talk about South Asian experience within Britain. Okay, so let's try to apply this to some of the texts that we read for today. So, do all of these writers that we looked at for today seem to adopt the same attitude towards language? How might we group these writers together as either assimilationists or abrogationists? which ones seem to fall on which side? Well, okay, let's start here. How many of them wrote their piece in a non-standard dialect? Okay, looks like we're starting from zero here, huh? All right, everybody turn to page 856 to Jamaica language. Yes, I know everybody's tired. I know this semester has been stressful, but I still expect people to do the fucking reading. All right. So, Jamaica language, Louise Bennett. Listen now. My Aunt Orochi say that it boiled her temper and really becks her for true anytime she hear anybody style we Jamaican dialect as corruption of the English language. For if that be the case, then them should have called English language corruption of Norman French and Latin and all them entire language, what them say that English is derived from. So first off, the style in which this is written. Is Bennett writing in standard English, in the Queen's English? No, she is consciously choosing to write in Jamaican English, right? So we can file this in the abrogation category. And what is the complaint that she's voicing here about the way Jamaican English is regarded by other English speakers?
It's hypocritical because the British English is derived from all the other.
Yeah, that's exactly the point here, right? She's saying that Jamaican dialect, so English speakers call Jamaican dialect a corruption, right? But English itself is not pure, right? No language is, right? All modern languages are derived from other languages, right? So one of the things she's pointing out is that English itself is derived from other sources, right, like Anglo-Saxon, or what we call Old English, from French, and from Latin. So, do we call Standard English a corruption of these languages? No. But, for some reason, Jamaican language, right, as she points out in the next short paragraph here, right, Unuhiri wood, derived. English is a derivation, but Jamaica dialect is corruption. What an unfairity. So she sets up this binary pair, right, derivation versus corruption, right? Now, in her view here, they're the same thing, right? That they both refer to the same linguistic process, the same linguistic practice, but why is one language labeled a corruption while the other is labeled a derivation? Right? What does corruption imply that derivation doesn't? Yeah. Corruption has negative connotations, right? Corruption suggests that it's impure or that there's something wrong with it, right? Whereas derivation is more kind of morally value neutral, right? So what is the real difference between a derivation and a corruption in this case? Why is Jamaican language labeled a corruption while Standard English is labeled a derivation?
sometimes they're a minority, so it's just easier to claim that.
Exactly. It's about the power relationship rather than about the language itself, right? The fact of the matter is the people who speak standard English have more cultural cachet and more political and economic power than the people who speak Jamaican English, right? So they can label their language a derivation, and this other version of English, this version of English that is spoken by people they regard as other, right, as a corruption. And then a lot of what Bennett is doing in the rest of this essay is trying to subvert all of these arguments about the superiority of the Queen's English in ways that's very similar to what MIA is doing in the Songlike Paper Plains, right? So, for Jamaican dialect did start when we English forefathers did start mussen bound we African ancestors we stop talk for them African language altogether and learn to talk so English because we English forefathers couldn't understand what we African ancestors them was to say to one another when them was to talk in them African language to them one another. And I will be honest, like I feel weird. I feel a little uncomfortable as a white dude reading out loud Jamaican dialect here. I do want to note that I have no intention to be insensitive or to make fun of any of this, right? You know, it's you know I'm not trying to appropriate anything here. But we African ancestors them pop we English forefathers them, yes. Pop them and disguise up the English language we project feed them African language in such a way that we English forefathers them still couldn't understand what we African ancestors them was a talk about when them was to talk to them one another. Yes, boy. So what she said, so what's the argument she's making here? What is she trying to point out here about the origins of Jamaican English? Why did Jamaicans start speaking English in the first place? Yeah, well, is it that they thought they couldn't speak their own languages? Or was it that they were forced to speak another language, right? So, note too, she says, we English ancestors and we African ancestors, right? So she claims descent here from both sides of this tree. But she's claiming that the English ancestors forced the African ancestors to abandon their original languages because they couldn't understand what they were saying, right? And then how do the African ancestors still get one over on the English ancestors? But we African ancestors them pop we English forefathers them, yes, pop them and disguise up the English language, we project for them African language, in such a way that we English forefathers them still couldn't understand what we African ancestors them was to talk about when them was to talk to them one another.
They were forced to speak English because the English people couldn't understand them, but they still probably can't understand them.
Yeah, what she's saying is that the dialect is in fact a strategy, right? It's like, okay, you're complaining that you don't understand what we say, and you're forcing us to speak your language, so we're going to speak your language back to you in a way that you still don't understand. So she's arguing that this is in fact a way of claim, of, you know, the way for the powerless to claim power, right? By maintaining some level of control over their language and over their means of expression. Now, the other thing that I want to point out in this, and one thing we should say about Louise Bennett as well, is that this piece is from a radio monologue that she did in character, right? So Bennett was an actor as well as a poet. She was trained in England, educated in England, and she gave these radio monologues in character as a kind of traditional Jamaican matron called Miss Lou. She also hosted a popular children's show on Jamaican television in the 70s and 80s. So this isn't really Louise Bennett speaking. It's Louise Bennett speaking through the character of Miss Lou. And one of the things that she demonstrates, particularly towards the end of this, is the capacity for code switching, right? If we look at the last two paragraphs here, right? Auntie Rochi said a Jamaica dialect is more direct and to the point than English. For all like how English Snotty would say, go away, Jamaican just say, gwe. And the only time we use more words than English is when we want to make something sound strong. Like when them is say something batter up. It sounds more expressive than if you say, it is battered. But most of all, we fling with all the bangrang and trimmings them, and only left what wanted. And that's why when English Snotty say, I got stuck by a prickle, Jamaican just say, maka juke me. So if we Jamaica language is no like English language corruption at all, and we know how to shame at it. Like one gal who did go to England and represent we Jamaican folks on one shift we got as the sole underwear garment I possess, and go sing Mama Mama them catch Papa as Mother Mother they apprehended Father. Right. So what she's demonstrating here is that she understands perfectly which English phrases correspond to Jamaican phrases. Right. You know, she understands how to say the same thing in standard English, but chooses not to. Right, for a variety, one, because she says that Jamaican dialect tends to be more concise, right? And things that sound natural in Jamaican dialect sound ridiculous in standard English. But yeah, I think she's also doing this to show that speaking in the Jamaican dialect is a choice rather than a necessity, right? That's what she's demonstrating through this code switching towards the end of the essay. And we should note also that all of the four writers that we're looking at today were educated largely in England, right? In fact, Bennett, like I said, was educated in a prestigious British acting academy. Salman Rushdie, Gugi Watongo, and Kamal Braithwaite all have advanced degrees from prestigious English universities, right? So these are people who are very familiar with English history, with English culture, and with the English educational system, right? Now, I want to turn to Kamal Braithwaite's arguments about what he calls nation language from here. So on page 861, Braithwaite's piece begins. Right, he says, what I'm going to talk about this morning is language from the Caribbean, the process of using English in a different way from the norm. English in a new sense, as I prefer to call it. English in an ancient sense. English in a very traditional sense. And sometimes not English at all, but language. So what do we already notice is different here from the structure and style of Bennett's essay? He's speaking in standard English, right? He's not speaking in dialect, although he is talking about what would be called dialect, right? So one thing, one reason for this is that the context is different. So Bennett is speaking in character on a radio show. Braithwaite is speaking at an academic conference to other academics. And so, to some extent, he has to adopt their language, right? The expected language of the academy in order to be understood here, in order to be, to be received, right? Now, why does he put the word norm here in quotes, do you think? When he says, he's talking about the process of using English in a different way from the norm. What's he suggesting about the word norm here by putting it in quotes?
That's what other people consider the norm, and not what the non-native people speak.
Yeah, when we put a word in quotes like this, right, usually what we're doing is kind of questioning that word and the conventional definition of it, right? So when we talk about a norm, in terms of language or culture, right, he is assuming that most of the people in his audience are going to regard the norm as a European norm, right? And that, like, this is a fairly common criticism of various kinds of European cultural institutions, right? So one of the criticisms that's usually leveled, for example, at Sigmund Freud today, right? The pioneering psychoanalyst, is that Freud's definition of normal and well-adjusted was basically, a white, male, middle-class, heterosexual, cisgender definition of normal, right? And trying to make everybody fit this particular set of standards. And Brathwaite is talking about a similar kind of thing with language, right? That we regard, the fact that we use a phrase like standard English, right, suggests what? What do we mean by a standard? If something is standard, what does that mean?
Traditional version?
Yeah, it's traditional, right? It's it's kind of the yardstick by which others are measured, right? Right, it's what's official. It's what's normal. Now, he goes on here to define what he calls nation language on the next page, right? On 862, he says, we in the Caribbean have a similar kind of plurality. We have English, which is the imposed language on much of the archipelago. English is an imperial language, as are French, Dutch, and Spanish, right? Keep track of some of these words, right? Imposed, imperial, right? Not only do they alliterate, they also have similar resonance, right? We have what we call Creole English, which is a mixture of English and an adaptation that English took in the new environment of the Caribbean when it became mixed with the other imported languages, right? Imported. Imposed, imperial, imported. We have also what is called nation language, which is the kind of English spoken by the people who were brought to the Caribbean, not the official English now, but the language of slaves and laborers, the servants who were brought in by the conquistadors. So he's making a distinction here between the English that is now spoken by most people in the Caribbean, who were descended from slaves and laborers, who come from a mix of African and Asian backgrounds, and the imposed, imperial, imported, official version of English. So all of this is associated with the, how do I want to phrase this? All of this is associated with the the powerful class, which again we have to know in the Caribbean is not the majority of the population, right? The Caribbean, for a long time, a small white minority held all the levers of power. So the number of people who actually speak standard English in their day-to-day lives, basically the same, is relatively small in much of the Caribbean. And there are reasons for this he goes into later on page 863. Right. In the Caribbean, as in South Africa, and in any area of cultural imperialism for that matter, the educational system did not recognize the presence of these various languages. So if you go to school, you're not going to be taught in this. You're only going to be taught in this. What our educational system did was to recognize and maintain the language of the conquistador, the language of the planter, the language of the official, the language of the Anglican preacher. It insisted that not only would English be spoken in the Anglophone Caribbean, but that the educational system would carry the contours of an English heritage. Hence, as Dennis said, Shakespeare, George Eliot, Jane Austen, British literature and literary forms, the models that were intimate to Great Britain, that had very little to do really with the environment and the reality of the Caribbean, were dominant in the Caribbean educational system. People were forced to learn things that had no relevance to themselves. Paradoxically, in the Caribbean, as in many other cultural disaster areas, the people educated in this system came to know more, even today, about English kings and queens than they do about our own national heroes, our own slave rebels, the people who helped to build and to destroy our society. We are more excited by English literary models, by the concept of, say, Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood, than we are by Nanny of the Maroons, a name some of us didn't even know until a few years ago. And in terms of what we write, our perceptual models, we are more conscious in terms of sensibility of the falling of snow, for instance. The models are all there for the falling of the snow, than of the force of the hurricanes that take place every year. In other words, we haven't got the syllables, the syllabic intelligence to describe the hurricane, which is our own experience, whereas we can describe the imported alien experience of the snowfall. It is that kind of situation we are in. Now compare this back to what we read last time, right? We talked about the day they burned the books. What are the things that Eddie says he hates?
Eddie?
Yeah, the character Eddie in The Day They Burned the Books. Do you remember what Eddie said specifically he hated? Yeah, he hates daffodils and he hates strawberries, right? And why does he hate them?
Because that's what they're supposed to like over there as an English person.
Yeah, because they're the English parents and the English power structure and the English schools are always trying to get across the superiority of these English things to them, right? But these are things they have no direct experience of. So what Braithwaite is saying here is actually something quite similar, right? Now he's not saying that he hates daffodils or strawberries, right? But he is saying that the kinds of things that are being taught in these school systems that are derived from the English model don't fit the actual experience of people in the Caribbean, right? So he says, we have the language, we're given the language to describe a snowfall, something most of us will never see in our lifetimes, but we don't have the language to describe the hurricane, which is much closer to our actual experience. Now, he uses the hurricane as a metaphor throughout the essay. Think about what a hurricane is and what it does. What is a hurricane? Yeah, heavy rain, right? Like out of control rain, right? What else does a hurricane bring?
Wind.
Yeah, heavy rain and out of control winds, right? So a hurricane is not a gentle storm, right? A hurricane is destructive. A hurricane is a potential disaster, right? Tornadoes form within hurricanes. There was, in I think 2007, there was a hurricane here that destroyed half the town, which is why I've always considered it a little bit strange that our school mascot is the Hurricanes. That seems like a weird thing to want to celebrate, but whatever, right? But is Britain a country that typically experiences hurricanes? Yeah, the climate is chilly and wet, right? But otherwise fairly mild. You don't get these kinds of serious, intense storms in England, in the British Isles generally, that you get in the Caribbean. So he talks about like the typical British model of poetry being, you know, the iambic pentameter, right? The dot 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 kind of rhythm, right? That very regular kind of heartbeat rhythm, as being fine for describing things like gentle snowfall. But if all you're learning is these English rhythms, right, you don't have a model for describing a disaster like a hurricane. So what he is arguing is that nation language, right, the language that is the English that is spoken by the majority of people in the Caribbean, can actually provide a better vocabulary for describing this kind of experience, this kind of disaster, right? And I think that what he's a big part of what he's doing is equating the idea of the hurricane with the idea of colonization and European dominance, right? That the original disaster is people being taken from Africa and brought to the Caribbean, and then not even being given their own language, not being able to use their own language to describe their experience, right? So the hurricane is a kind of continual, recurring, cyclical disaster that comes back every year. So from where we stand now, having looked over Brathwaite and Bennett, where would we put them on the assimilation versus abrogation scale? Yeah, they're both really much more on the side of abrogation here, right? While they both demonstrate understanding and facility with the Queen's English, they're both arguing that it's insufficient for describing Caribbean experience. And that in order to adequately describe that experience, you need local linguistic forms. Now, we're going to see something similar but a little bit more extreme with Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and I usually refer to authors by their last names, but Watongo is actually his personal name, and Ngugi is his family name. That's the way Gikuyu names work, right? So the family name comes first, the personal name comes second. So we're going to refer to him as Ngugi, so don't get confused by that. To give you some sense of the direction that his essay takes, his legal name when he was born in Kenya was James Ngugi. In the 60s, he started going by Ngugi wa Thiong'o as he embarked on his career as a writer and as an academic. And he no longer writes in English. In fact, this particular essay is a kind of farewell to writing in English and a return to writing in Gikuyu, which seems like an odd choice, right? From an economic standpoint, because you would probably limit your audience that way, right? There are far fewer Gikuyu speakers in the world than there are English speakers. But by the time he made this change, he was already one of the most internationally famous African novelists. So he can be assured that his books are translated into English and French and other European languages. So they're still available in those languages, he won't write in them anymore. So let's look at Ngugi's argument here in this excerpt from Decolonizing the Mind. So the first thing that I want to bring to your attention here is the value systems that he associates with different languages, right? So there are value systems that he associates with Kikuyu and value systems that he associates with English. So let's start here with Kikuyu. Page 868. I was born into a large peasant family, father, 4 wives, and about 28 children. I also belonged, as we all did in those days, to a wider extended family and to the community as a whole. We spoke Kikuyu as we worked in the fields. We spoke Kikuyu in and outside the home. I can vividly recall those evenings of storytelling around the fireside. It was mostly the grown-ups telling the children, but everybody was interested and involved. We children would retell the stories the following day to other children who worked in the fields picking the pyrethrum flowers, tea leaves, or coffee beans of our European and African landlords. The stories, with mostly animals as the main characters, were all told in Kikuyu. Hare, being small, weak, but full of innovative wit and cunning, was our hero. We identified with him as he struggled against the brutes of prey like lion, leopard, hyena. His victories were our victories, and we learnt that the apparently weak can outwit the strong. We followed the animals in their struggle against hostile nature, drought, rain, sun, wind, a confrontation often forcing them to search for forms of cooperation. But we were also interested in their struggles amongst themselves, and particularly between the beasts and the victims of prey. These twin struggles against nature and other animals reflected real-life struggles in the human world. Not that we neglected stories with human beings as the main characters. There were 2 types of characters in such human-centered narratives. The species of truly human beings with qualities of courage, kindness, mercy, hatred of evil, concern for others, and a man-eat-man, two-mouth species with qualities of greed, selfishness, individualism, and hatred of what was good for the larger cooperative community. Cooperation as the ultimate good in a community was a constant theme. It could unite human beings with animals against ogres and beasts of prey, as in the story of how Dove, after being fed with castor oil seeds, was sent to fetch a smith working far away from home and whose pregnant wife was being threatened by these man-eating two-mouthed ogres. So what things and what values does he associate with the speaking of Kikuyu?
The different stories that they were always told to kids.
Okay, yeah, what values is he getting from these stories, right? What's the important lesson of these stories?
That even though they may not be the biggest and strongest animals, they can be very important, and they also can always outsmart those of the.
Okay, so one thing he gets is the kind of like victory of the underdog, right? And do the heroes of these stories that he talks about typically succeed on their own? The stories are about cooperation, right? And he associates them with family and with community, right? Right, he's a member of this large family group, right? There's no nuclear family, as there would be, as it develops in 19th century England, in this situation. He's got, 27 siblings and half-siblings. And, the broader community gets together to tell these stories, right? So all of this is associated with a kind of group identity, right? And with group cooperation. Now, when he gets to school and is being taught in English, let's look at how this is different. Right, on page 869, it was after the declaration of a state of emergency over Kenya in 1952 that all the schools run by patriotic nationalists were taken over by the colonial regime and were placed under district education boards chaired by Englishmen. English became the language of my formal education. In Kenya, English became more than a language. It was the language, and all the others had to bow before it in deference. Thus, one of the most humiliating experiences was to be caught speaking Kikuyu in the vicinity of the school. The culprit was given corporal punishment, 3 to 5 strokes of the cane on bare buttocks, or was made to carry a metal plate around the neck with inscriptions such as, "I am stupid," or "I am a donkey." Sometimes the culprits were fined money they could hardly afford. And how did the teachers catch the culprits? A button was initially given to one pupil who was supposed to hand it over to whoever was caught speaking his mother tongue. Whoever had the button at the end of the day would sing who had given it to him, and the ensuing process would bring out all the culprits of the day. Thus, the children were turned into witch hunters. In the process, were being taught the lucrative value of being a traitor to one's immediate community. The attitude to English was the exact opposite. Any achievement in spoken or written English was highly rewarded. Prizes, prestige, applause, the ticket to higher realms. English became the measure of intelligence and ability in the arts, the sciences, and all the other branches of learning. English became the main determinant of a child's progress up the ladder of formal education. As you may know, the colonial system of education, in addition to its apartheid racial demarcation, had the structure of a pyramid. A broad primary base, a narrowing secondary middle, and an even narrower university apex. Selections from primary into secondary were through an examination, in my time called Kenya African Preliminary Examination, in which one had to pass 6 subjects ranging from maths to nature study and Kiswahili. All the papers were written in English. Nobody could pass the exam who failed the English language paper, no matter how brilliantly he had done in the other subjects. I remember one boy in my class of 1954 who had distinctions in all subjects except English, which he had failed. He was made to fail the entire exam. He went on to become a turn boy in a bus company. I, who had only passes but a credit in English, got a place at the Alliance High School, one of the most elitist institutions for Africans in colonial Kenya. So, what values has he come to associate with English? Okay, so he's punished if he doesn't speak it, right? And what else? Why does English become so important? If we look at the way this educational system is structured, right? Is this a system where everybody in primary school automatically moves on to high school? Or where people in high school can automatically move on to university? No, you have to take tests at each level, right? If you don't pass the tests at the end of primary school, you don't get into high school. And if you don't pass the tests at the end of high school, you don't get into university, right? All of the tests are conducted in English, and there are a limited number of seats in each level of the pyramid, right? So what then does English become associated with here? On the one hand, advancement, right? But what other value that's antithetical to these Kikuyu values is taught? Yeah, individualism and competition, right? And not in a positive way either, right? If we look at the story about how students are rooted, like, how are students caught in this primary school speaking English? Who turns them in? Yeah, the students are turned against each other, right? Rather than cooperating with each other, it's in their best interest to rat out their fellows, right? Because then they will get rewards and advancement and help, move them up the pyramid, right? We have this example here too. The smartest kid in his class in 1954 does brilliantly on every part of the exam except the English exam and has to fail the whole thing, right? Whereas Googie notes that he passed every subject and only got a distinction in English, right? That's the only subject he did particularly well in. But because he did well in English, he gets moved on up through the system, right? Doesn't matter how he did in chemistry or in biology or whatever. So this language becomes associated with advancement, with individualism and competition, and also with betrayal. Right, with turning your back on your community and your fellows in order to benefit yourself. Right, so think about those stories that he talks about that feature the man-eat-man, two-mouthed ogres, right? With qualities of greed, selfishness, individualism, and hatred of what was good for the larger cooperative community, right? I think the two mouths here are an important representation here as well. The fact that, he's looking at a culture in which everybody is to some extent bilingual, right? If you develop the facility in both of these, both of these tongues or both of these mouths, right, and you choose this one over the other, then you are adopting these same qualities of greed and selfishness. All right, so where would we put Googie in this assimilation abrogation scheme? Where does he seem to fit? Well, he was made to assimilate as a child, right? But does he seem to think that this was a good thing? Yeah, in fact, he kind of remembers this kind of broken, almost like Edenic childhood, right? With his whole family and community telling these stories together, and then that's destroyed by this colonial schooling system. Remember also that by the time he writes this essay, he only writes fiction in Kikuyu now, right? So he's really more on the abrogation side, right? So all three that we've looked at so far have been on the abrogation side. Now, I want to briefly consider, before we finish up here, Salman Rushdie's arguments. Now, Rushdie is coming from a different perspective than these other three writers in a number of ways, right? One, is class difference. Rushdie comes from a wealthy Indian family. Another is national difference, right? So Googie is Kenyan. Brathwaite and Bennett were both from the Caribbean. Rushdie is South Asian, Muslim, with relatives in India and Pakistan. Right, he has family on both sides of that 1947 border. A lot of people do. And the third difference here is in the attitude he takes towards English. And a lot of this is a direct result of his specific South Asian context, right? So I want to point out, so he talks at the beginning of his essay on page 880 about English being the world language, right? It's the most, being the most, it's not the language that is spoken by the largest number of people in the world, but is the most widely spoken language in the world. On page 880, bottom of the page, right? To take the case of India, only because it's the one with which I'm most familiar. The debate about the appropriateness of English in post-British India has been raging ever since 1947. But today I find it is a debate which has meaning only for the older generation. The children of independent India seem not to think of English as being irredeemably tainted by its colonial provenance. They use it as an Indian language, one of the tools they have to hand. I am simplifying, of course, but the point is broadly true. There is also an interesting north-south divide in Indian attitudes to English. In the north, the so-called Hindi belt, where the capital, Delhi, is located, it is possible to think of Hindi as a future national language. But in South India, which is at present suffering from the attempts of the central government to impose this national language on it, the resentment of Hindi is far greater than of English. After spending quite some time in South India, I've become convinced that English is an essential language in India, not only because of its technical vocabularies and the international communication which it makes possible, but also simply to permit two Indians to talk to each other in a language which neither party hates. So what he is referring to is India's multicultural, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic makeup, right? And this is something that predates any Englishman setting foot in South Asia, right? And what he is arguing here is that English, as a language that has no specific Indian ethnic or religious connotations, can be used as a kind of neutral language of communication for people from different parts of the country or people who speak different home languages, right? So not only is it a means of connecting connecting India with the wider world. And remember that, that's an argument that we remember from as far back as Thomas Babington Macaulay, right? He was worried primarily about easing trade within the British Empire, and so thinks that at least the elite people in India should all be taught English. But yeah, he's looking at English as a kind of compromise language between different groups within India. Now, I think it's also probably worth noting that unlike the others, like who all had their university education in Britain, Rushdie was educated almost entirely in England. Right? English boarding school, then on to Cambridge, then continued to live in England without, going back to live in India, right? So this is someone who adopted England as his residence from a very young age. And the last thing I want to look at here is the final paragraph here on page 882, right? As far as English lit itself is concerned, I think that if all English literatures could be studied together, a shape would emerge which would truly reflect the new shape of the language in the world, and we could see that English lit has never been in better shape because the world language now also possesses a world literature which is proliferating in every conceivable direction. The English language ceased to be the sole possession of the English some time ago. So what Rushdie is adopting here is what we call a cosmopolitan attitude towards language and literature. Right? Do we remember what this word means, what cosmopolitan means?
You see yourself as not a member of a nation, but of the world.
Yeah, a cosmopolitan is it literally means citizen of the world, right? So the basic argument that he's making is that because English language and literature have spread to so many different corners of the world, right, that it's no longer, it doesn't belong to the British or their empire anymore, right? That, in fact, other people have taken it and recast it and written quality literature in it. And it's time to stop thinking about British literature as a separate national category and to start thinking about a kind of world Anglophone literature right, which contains British literature within it, but is but doesn't privilege one national tradition over another, right? So where would we put Rushdie in the assimilation abrogation scheme? It's a little complicated, right? He's probably closer to the assimilation side of this, but the argument that he's making is that using English in his writings and using English as a spoken language in India isn't necessarily blending in, right? Isn't necessarily assimilating. That in fact you can take this and reframe it to suit your particular context, as people are doing in India all the time, he says, right? So the important stuff to remember for next time, right? Right, in addition to what we've said about specific authors, right? Remember the stuff about code switching, right? Remember the stuff about alterity. Remember the stuff about assimilation and abrogation, right? This is all stuff that we're going to talk about again when we come back from break. We're going to be applying this to poetry specifically. All right, so everybody have a good break, and we'll see you when we return.